Look, I need to get this off my chest, because everyone in my life seems to have collectively decided I'm the villain here. And frankly, that's complete and utter garbage. My name is Alara. I'm 29 years old, and apparently, I'm some kind of heartless monster, because I didn't immediately burst into tears and say yes, the 2 times my boyfriend proposed. Excuse me for wanting to be absolutely unequivocally sure about the single biggest decision of my entire life. But no, according to the jury of my peers, I should have just flung myself at the first diamond he waved in my face. Because I'm getting older. Because my biological clock is supposedly ticking like a time bomb. Please. I was with Reese for 4 years. 4 years. And yes, of course, I loved him. But love isn't everything, you know? Anyone with a shred of sense knows that. There is so much more that goes into a successful, lifelong marriage than just a fluttery feeling in your stomach. There's practicality, ambition, compatibility on a level that goes deeper than enjoying the same TV shows. I work in corporate administration paperwork, scheduling, managing the chaotic lives of people who make far more money than I do. It's not glamorous, but it's organized, and I'm good at it. Reese works in shipping and logistics. He's always been the steady type, which is nice, I guess. It's comforting. But sometimes, I lie awake at night and wonder if steady is just a more polite word for boring. Don't get me wrong, he's a genuinely sweet guy. He remembers my coffee order, he puts up with my moods, he's kind to my parents. But he's also the kind of man who, after 4 years together, still asks me what I want for dinner every single night. Every single night. It's like he's physically incapable of making a decision without my explicit approval. For the first year, I thought it was thoughtful, a sign that he valued my opinion above all else. By year 2, it started to feel like a lack of initiative. By year 4, it was honestly just exhausting. Sometimes, I just want a man to take charge. To say, we're having Italian tonight, I've made a reservation. But with Reese, everything was a question directed at me. Where should we go this weekend, Alara? What do you think would make you happy? Are you sure you're okay with this? It was like he was constantly seeking my validation, my stamp of approval on his very existence. I suppose it's flattering, in a way, to be the center of someone's universe. But it's also a tremendous amount of pressure. It's like I was managing his life on top of my own. I appreciate that he cared about my opinion, but did he have to ask about literally everything? The irony, and it's not lost on me, is that for the first half of our relationship, I was the one who needed more reassurance. I was the one constantly asking where we were headed. I'd poke and prod, asking if he was happy, if he really saw a future with me, if he was sure about us. He always was. His answers were always a calm, unwavering, yes. But when he'd try to turn the tables and ask me the same questions, I'd get defensive. Prickly. Why does he need to know every single detail of how I'm feeling? Can't he just trust that I'm with him because I want to be? I've always been someone who needs to feel completely, 100% secure before making a big move. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's called being prudent. Other girls might leap into an engagement because they're desperate for a wedding or terrified of being single forever. But I'm not like that. I actually think about the consequences. I think about financial stability, shared life goals, and all the practical, unsexy stuff that actually matters in the long run. Between us, I've also been conducting what I call reality checks throughout our relationship. Little tests, nothing major, you understand. Just small, controlled situations to see how he'd handle them, to make sure he was truly as committed as he claimed to be. I needed to know that he'd fight for me if it came down to it, that he'd choose me over his friends, that he'd get just the right amount of jealous if another guy paid me a little too much attention. I think that's pretty normal, actually. Every woman should know where she stands with her man. Sometimes I'd pull back a little, become emotionally distant just to see his reaction. And like clockwork, he'd always come running back, doubling his efforts, showering me with more attention. It was stressful for him, I'm sure, but it proved to me that he really cared. I keep track of things too. Not in a crazy spreadsheet kind of way, just mentally noting patterns. When he doesn't text back fast enough. When he makes plans with his buddies without checking with me first. He has this infuriating habit of dismissing my concerns when I bring these things up, telling me I'm overthinking or being too sensitive. But I'm not being sensitive. I'm being observant. There's a world of difference, to our friends. We were the perfect couple. The stable ones. And I worked hard to maintain that image, because the last thing I needed was everyone else's opinion in our business. But privately, there were things about him that drove me insane. He wasn't ambitious enough. He was content with his mediocre job, his simple life. He didn't always pick up on social cues the way I wished he would. When we were out with people, I sometimes felt like I had to guide the conversation for him or cover for his awkward silences. It's not that he's a bad person, he's just not as polished as I'd like him to be. The other women in our friend group were always going on about how lucky I was, what a catch Reese was. It honestly got on my nerves, because they only see the surface. They don't live with his flaws every day like I do. They don't see how he leaves his wet towel on the bed or how he can be completely oblivious when I'm trying to hint at something I want. But whatever. I'd just smile and play the part of the happy, devoted girlfriend. That's what you do. By year 3, I could feel the shift. The pressure was mounting. Reese started bringing up marriage more often, talking about kids in a not-so-hypothetical way. He'd even start looking at houses online, turning his laptop toward me with a hopeful look in his eyes, showing me listings for charming suburban homes he thought I'd like. Instead of feeling excited, I mostly just felt cornered. Suffocated. Why did everything have to be on his timeline? Why couldn't he just be happy with what we had and let things develop naturally, at my pace? Whenever he'd bring up engagement rings or wedding venues, I'd deftly change the subject or give some vague non-committal response. I just wasn't ready to have those conversations yet. I needed more time to figure out if this was really, truly what I wanted for the rest of my life. But he kept pushing, his hints becoming more and more obvious. So, the first proposal. It happened at our beach, the same spot where we had our first date. He'd been acting weird all week, more nervous and fidgety than usual, constantly checking his phone and being secretive about our Friday night plans. I knew something was up. A part of me was even morbidly curious to see what he'd do, how he'd handle it. When we got to the beach that evening and he started getting all sentimental, talking about our memories there, I knew exactly what was coming. He launched into this whole speech, and then he got down on one knee and pulled out a small velvet box. And my very first thought wasn't about our love, or our future, or the man kneeling in front of me. My first thought was, how incredibly basic. The beach again. He couldn't come up with something more creative, more memorable? I mean, I appreciate the sentiment, I do, but I've seen proposal videos online that were 10 times more impressive. When he finally asked me to marry him, his voice trembling slightly, I felt this bizarre cocktail of pressure and irritation. Here he was, putting me on the spot in a public place, expecting me to have this huge, emotional breakdown of joy like you see in the movies. But that's just not how I work. I'm a processor. I need time to analyze big decisions from every possible angle, and I do not like being forced into a reaction. So, I told him what felt right, what felt honest in that moment. I looked him in the eye and said carefully, "I want to marry you, but not right now." I chose those words so deliberately. I wanted to let him know that I wasn't rejecting him as a person, just the timing of it all. But I could see how much my answer shattered him. His face just crumpled. And honestly, a small, dark part of me felt bad about that. But another, more honest part of me felt powerful, seeing how much my response affected him, how my words could bring this strong, steady man to the brink of tears. It proved how important I was to him. It showed me that he really, truly needed me, that I had this incredible control over his happiness. I know that sounds terrible, but it's the truth. After the initial shock wore off, I explained that I just wasn't in the right headspace to get engaged, that I had personal things I needed to work through, that I just needed a little more time. What I didn't tell him were my real reasons. The first was that, at 26, I wasn't completely convinced he was my best option. I felt like I still had time to see what else was out there. The second reason was that I wanted him to prove himself more before I committed my entire life to him. I needed to see him work harder, make more money, show me that he could provide the kind of lifestyle I envisioned for myself. The ring was nice, but it wasn't amazing. I wanted to see if he'd step up his game if I made him wait. In the weeks that followed, I watched him struggle with disappointment and confusion, and I managed his emotions carefully. I gave him just enough affection to keep him from walking away, but not so much that he felt secure. He needed to understand that my love wasn't a guarantee. It was something he had to keep earning. The year between the first and second proposal was what I privately called my testing phase. I needed to really understand what kind of man I was dealing with, and whether he had the backbone to handle a strong, discerning woman like me. I started pushing his boundaries, more systematically this time. I'd question his plans with his friends, making pointed comments about how real partners prioritize their relationship above everything else. When he'd make plans without consulting me first, I'd give him the silent treatment for a day or two, until he learned his lesson and came back apologizing, promising to ask for my input next time. I wasn't trying to be controlling. I was just trying to get him to consider my feelings before making decisions that affected our time together. I'll admit, I did enjoy watching him modify his behavior to avoid upsetting me. It was gratifying. It showed me that I mattered, that he was willing to change and adapt for the sake of our relationship. During this time, I also started developing what I called professional friendships, most notably with Vaughn, a senior manager from another department at my workplace who had recently gotten divorced. Vaughn was everything Reese wasn't. Sharp, ambitious, and dripping with the kind of confidence that only comes from experience and financial success. We'd grab coffee sometimes to talk about work, and he'd give me incredible advice about career advancement and office politics. I wasn't doing anything inappropriate. It was just a friendship with someone who understood ambition in a way that Reese simply didn't. Vaughn would compliment my intelligence and my drive. He made me feel seen and appreciated for qualities that Reese sometimes seemed to take for granted. It was refreshing to have someone recognize my potential instead of just accepting me as I was. I never crossed any lines with Vaughn, of course, but I enjoyed the attention. It served as a constant reminder that other men, successful men, found me interesting and attractive. It kept things in perspective for me, reminding me of what I could have if I wanted it. Meanwhile, my expectations for Reese continued to evolve. I wanted him to plan more creative dates, to remember every little preference I'd ever mentioned offhandedly, to constantly demonstrate his commitment through grand, meaningful gestures. When he'd invariably fall short of these ever-shifting goalposts, I'd withdraw emotionally. I'd become quiet and distant until he figured out what he'd done wrong and made it up to me, usually with flowers or a more expensive dinner than he could probably afford. I saw this as teaching him how to love me properly, showing him what I needed to feel valued and secure. I'd vent to my girlfriends about his shortcomings, but always in a loving, concerned way. I'd sigh and say things like, "I just worry he's not as ambitious as I'd hoped," or, "He sometimes misses social cues that seem so obvious to me, you know?" My friends were always supportive, agreeing that I deserved someone who could really match my energy. But I always made sure to balance the complaints with just enough positive comments so they wouldn't think I was just being negative. It was all about maintaining the right image. As we approached the 1-year anniversary of his first failed proposal, I noticed Reese becoming more distant. He stopped asking my opinion about every little thing. He started making plans with his friends without checking in with me first. At first, this annoyed me because it felt like he was pulling away, like my influence was waning. But then, a part of me thought it might actually be a good sign. Maybe my tests were working. Maybe he was finally developing some independence, some backbone. Still, it made me nervous. I was so used to having him on a short leash, and this new behavior was unpredictable. I found myself giving him more attention and affection during this period. Not because I was feeling particularly more loving, but because I needed to make sure he wasn't losing interest. It was a strategic move. I started initiating more physical contact, planning surprise date nights, and being more vocally supportive of his work. I had to keep him invested in us while I continued to figure out my own feelings. I knew another proposal was coming. I'd been dropping hints, saying I was feeling more ready for the next step. But internally, I was just as unsure as ever. The truth is, I was enjoying the dynamic we had. He was constantly working to win me over, while I maintained my independence and my options. I wasn't ready to give up that power by committing to marriage, but I was definitely curious to see if he'd try again, and how he'd do it this time. The second proposal happened at the Botanical Garden downtown. I could tell immediately that he'd put way more thought, effort, and money into this one. Our friends had helped him plan it, which honestly just annoyed me. Now there were other people invested in my answer, an audience to my decision. I felt the weight of their collective expectation, and I resented it. I felt pressured by the whole romantic setup, the roses, the fountain, the whole elaborate theatrical scene he'd created. It was beautiful, I'll give him that. But it also felt like he was trying to manipulate my emotions with all the pageantry. When he got down on one knee again, holding a noticeably larger and more impressive ring, I felt that familiar mix of power and irritation wash over me. I was impressed by the effort, yes, but I was also frustrated that he was forcing me into another decision point when I'd already told him I needed more time. In that moment, standing there looking at him, my mind drifted to Vaughn. Vaughn had recently mentioned that his divorce was final and he was ready to start dating again. He'd made a few comments about how lucky Reese was to have me. I couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to be with someone who truly appreciated my worth from the very beginning, someone I didn't have to train. So, when Reese asked me to marry him for the second time, I said, "Not just yet." I chose those words specifically to keep him hoping, to buy myself more time to figure out what I really wanted. I could see the hurt in his eyes, but this time it was different. It wasn't just disappointment, it was frustration. It was the look of a man who was running out of patience. Instead of just accepting my answer like before, he stayed on one knee for a moment, then slowly stood up. He started asking me direct questions. "What's holding you back, Alara? When do you think you'll be ready?" His tone was different too. Less pleading and more demanding, which caught me completely off guard. I tried to give him the same vague explanations as before, about wanting to be absolutely sure, but he wasn't buying it this time. "What exactly are you waiting for?" he pushed. "What will it take to make you feel ready?" I felt cornered. I couldn't exactly tell him the truth, that I was keeping my options open and waiting to see if something better came along. After I gave him some non-answer about needing to be sure, I saw him get angry in a way I'd never seen before. "4 years, Alara," he said, his voice low and tight. "After 4 years, if you're not sure by now, what could possibly ever make you sure?" That stung, because it made me sound indecisive and flaky, which is the complete opposite of how I see myself. "I'm just careful." Then he said the words that made my stomach drop. "I'm not going to keep waiting for you to decide if I'm good enough. I'm done wasting my time." Panic set in. Not because I couldn't imagine a life without him, but because I was about to lose the comfortable, predictable dynamic where I held all the power. I liked having someone so devoted to me, someone who made me the center of his world, and I was not ready to give that up. So I did what I always did when I was about to lose an argument. I started to cry. The tears, the vulnerability, it was a tactic that normally got him to back down immediately, to rush to my side and comfort me. But this time, he just stood there, watching me cry with a cold, hard expression on his face. He didn't try to fix it. I could see I was losing control of the situation, and that scared me more than the idea of losing him. In a moment of pure desperation, my voice cracking, I blurted out, "Fine, fine, I'll marry you. Please, just don't go." But even as I said it, I knew it was coming from the wrong place. I wasn't saying yes because I wanted to marry him. I was saying it because I wanted to win. I wanted to maintain control. He just looked at me, a deep sadness in his eyes, and shook his head slowly. Then he turned around and walked away. I stood there, completely shocked, surrounded by roses and the dying light. I had never seen him stand so firm before. I didn't know how to handle a version of Reese who wouldn't bend to my will. The aftermath of Reese leaving was complete chaos, but not in the way everyone expected. I wasn't devastated about losing the supposed love of my life. I was absolutely furious about losing control of the situation. My first instinct was to blame everyone else for this mess. Our friends should have talked some sense into him, instead of helping him plan that ridiculous high-pressure proposal. His family probably supported his decision to leave me, even though they barely knew the real me. Other women must have been filling his head with nonsense about what he deserved, making him think he was too good for someone who just needed a little more time to be sure. I was shocked that he didn't come crawling back within a few days. That was our pattern. We'd fight, I'd get upset, he'd give me space, and then he'd be the one to apologize first, to reach out and fix things. I had gotten so used to him being the peacemaker that I just assumed he was being overly dramatic and would come to his senses. But days turned into a week, then 2 weeks, and still, nothing. That's when I started my campaign to control the narrative. I began calling our mutual friends, telling them carefully edited versions of our breakup story, versions that made me look reasonable and him look impatient and demanding. I emphasized how I just wanted to be absolutely sure about such a big decision. I talked about how hurt I was that he'd given me an ultimatum instead of being patient with the woman he claimed to love. I painted myself as the victim of his unrealistic expectations and his emotional manipulation. For the most part, it worked. Most of our female friends completely understood my position and were incredibly sympathetic about how pressured I must have felt. The attention and sympathy felt good, honestly. People were checking on me, bringing me food, validating my feelings. I relished the role of the wounded party. But I was getting increasingly frustrated that some people, especially his close friends, weren't buying my version of events. They seemed to think he had been more than patient. Whatever. They were clearly biased. Anyway, I became obsessed with monitoring what Reese was doing. I stalked his social media constantly, analyzing every post, every like, looking for any sign that he was missing me or regretting his decision. I'd ask mutual friends casual questions about him, trying to sound merely concerned rather than desperate for information. I even started driving by places I thought he might be, just to see if I could catch a glimpse of him and gauge his emotional state. But the reports I was getting back were not what I wanted to hear. According to everyone, he seemed to be doing fine. Better than fine. He wasn't posting sad song lyrics or moping around like I expected. Instead, he appeared to be focusing on himself. He was hanging out with his buddies more, going to the gym, and, according to some people, even seemed happier. This made me absolutely furious. How dare he act like losing me was no big deal? How could he possibly seem better off without me, when I had been the best thing in his life for 4 years? I started planting subtle criticisms about him in conversations with our friend group. Nothing too obvious. Just little comments about his communication issues, his emotional immaturity, his inability to handle a strong woman who knew her own mind. I needed people to understand that this breakup was actually his fault, not mine. I had to control how people saw our relationship and make sure they didn't think he was some kind of victim. He was the one who gave up. He was the one who couldn't handle it. I was just being honest about my feelings, and he punished me for it. He was childish and stubborn, and I was starting to convince myself that he was the problem all along. 6 months after Reese left, the universe decided to completely and utterly destroy my life in the most painful way possible. I found out through social media that he wasn't just moving on, he was absolutely thriving without me. A new girl had started appearing in his posts. Her name was Maeve. She worked as a nurse or something equally perfect and wholesome. And from what I could gather from her annoyingly cheerful online profile, she seemed sweet and supportive. But what really killed me wasn't just that he was with someone else. It was how completely, fundamentally different their relationship looked from ours. In every single photo, they both looked genuinely happy. Relaxed. There was no undercurrent of drama, no testing, no games. She never posted cryptic quotes about relationships or made passive-aggressive comments about needing space. They just seemed to enjoy each other's company, without all the complexity and hard work that I thought was normal in any serious relationship. I spent hours, entire nights, analyzing their social media interactions, scrolling back through months of posts, looking for cracks, for signs of problems or incompatibility. But everything seemed disgustingly healthy. The devastating blow came when I learned through our mutual friends that Reese had proposed to Maeve after only 8 months of dating, and she had said yes, immediately. 8 months. The number echoed in my head, a mocking laugh. 8 months. I'd had 4 years, 48 months to figure out my feelings. And this girl, this stranger, knew after less than a year that she wanted to spend the rest of her life with him. The engagement announcement was everywhere, a tidal wave of happy photos and congratulatory comments. People wrote things like, "So perfect for each other," and "About time Reese found someone who truly appreciates him." One comment in particular felt like a direct, personal attack. "Maeve clearly knows a good man when she sees one." The implication was deafening. I had been too stupid to recognize what I had. When I tried to make subtle, negative comments to my friends about how rushed their engagement was, people started pushing back. For the first time, they weren't just placating me. They started pointing out that I'd had plenty of time to appreciate Reese and had actively chosen not to. My own friends began to distance themselves from me as they realized I was just being bitter instead of supportive. They started making comments about how I needed to move on and be happy for him, which just made me even angrier. Couldn't they see how fundamentally unfair this whole situation was to me? But the absolute worst part, the final, crushing nail in the coffin, was learning that Reese had been promoted to a regional manager position at work, and he and Maeve were buying a house together. Everything I had wanted from him. All the financial stability and ambition I had demanded he proved to me, he was now effortlessly providing for someone else. For someone who had never asked him to prove a single thing. Maeve never made him jump through hoops. She never made him earn her love through grand gestures or emotional trials. She simply loved him and built a life with him, which, apparently, was all he had ever wanted. I came to the sickening realization that while I had been testing his devotion and making him work for my approval, she had simply been his partner and his supporter. While I had been keeping my options open and cultivating other friendships, she had been building a future with him. While I had been analyzing his every flaw and pushing him to be better, she had been accepting him exactly as he was and growing with him. It made me physically sick to realize that everything I thought made me a smart, careful woman actually just made me look like an idiot who didn't know what she had until it was gone. In my desperation, spiraling in a vortex of jealousy and rage, I made one final, pathetic attempt to reclaim some semblance of control over the situation. I sent Reese a long, carefully crafted message. I poured every ounce of my manipulative talent into it, explaining how I was ready now, how his leaving had been the wake-up call I needed. I told him I finally realized what I'd lost, and that we could work things out if he was just willing to try again. I told him that what we had was real and deep in a way that his new, shiny relationship couldn't possibly match. I wrote, "She will never understand you the way I do." His response came less than an hour later. It was brief and absolutely crushing. He told me he was happy with his life and wished me well, but that he wasn't interested in looking backward. He said he hoped I would find what I was looking for, but that it wouldn't be with him. The message was polite but final. It was a steel door slamming shut in my face. And in that moment, I knew with chilling certainty that I no longer had any power over him whatsoever. I had become completely, utterly irrelevant to his happiness and his success. So here I am now, sitting in my apartment, the silence deafening, scrolling through photos of their engagement party on a friend's profile. I'm consumed with a rage, so profound it feels like a physical illness. But I still refuse to admit that any of this is my fault. It can't be. I'm convinced that Reese was just impatient. He couldn't handle being with a woman who had standards, who challenged him to be better. And Maeve. She obviously just settled for the first decent guy who came along, which says more about her desperation than his worth. Our friends, they all chose sides based on superficial nonsense instead of trying to understand the real, complex dynamics of our relationship. And society as a whole pressures women to settle down, to snatch up any man who shows interest, instead of encouraging them to take their time and make smart, calculated decisions about their own futures. Everyone failed me in this situation. Every single person. But I'm the one who has to live with the consequences of their shortcomings. Whatever. I dodged a bullet anyway. That's what I tell myself. Because if Reese couldn't wait for me to be 100% ready, then he obviously wasn't the right person for me in the first place.